Get your filthy hands off my son." The hallway fell into a stunned silence as Gregory Whitmore's voice sliced through the stillness. It was the image before him. Kneeling beside his 10-year-old son, Caleb, was a woman in a faded janitor's uniform. Her back was slightly hunched from years of cleaning, and her graying hair peeked from under a bandana tied tightly around her head. Her name tag read, Laverne, and her hands, worn and calloused, were gently pressing a cloth against the boy's bloodied eyebrow. Moments earlier, it had all happened so fast, just a blur of sneakers, sneering faces, and fists clenched in cruelty. "Daddy's money can't save you, rich boy," one of the older kids had jeered before shoving him hard into the lockers. His head hit the edge. Then laughter. Then silence. They left him there, alone, humiliated, and bleeding. Caleb pressed the sleeve of his shirt against his eye, trying to stop the bleeding, but only smeared it further. The sting made his breath catch. He clenched his jaw, biting the inside of his lip to keep from making a sound. "Sweetheart, don't touch that cut," a woman's voice said gently. "You'll only make it worse." Now, Caleb's left eye was already swelling shut. His pale blue shirt was stained crimson at the collar, and he sat trembling against the row of lockers, his fingers curled tight around the fabric of the woman's sleeve. His breathing was shallow, the hiccuping breath of a boy trying hard not to cry. Mr. Whitmore stormed forward. "I said get away from him." Miss Laverne stood quickly, raising both palms. "Sir, please, he was hurt, I just—" Whitmore's hand struck her shoulder hard. The briefcase clattered to the floor. With a sudden shove, he slammed her backward. Her head hit the row of metal lockers with a sharp, sickening thud. Caleb gasped. Laverne slid down the locker, her back pressed against the cold steel. One hand flew to the back of her head where blood began to seep through her curls. Her eyes widened, not just from the pain, but from sheer disbelief. "I found him like this hurt," she said quickly. "He was alone. I just couldn't leave him there." Gregory's eyes narrowed into slits. He stepped forward, towering over her. "Or maybe you saw an opportunity. A chance to play hero. Or worse." She tried to speak again. "Please, sir. I work here. Caleb's eyes widened in horror. "Dad." Miss Laverne, dazed, pressed her palm against the locker to steady herself. Blood streaked down her fingers. Tears welled in her eyes, but she still turned to Caleb, desperate. "Baby, please," she whispered, voice trembling. Tell your daddy I was only helping." "No." Caleb's mind screamed. "Tell him. Say it." But fear curled around his voice like a fist. The heat of his father's anger, the years of hearing, "Boys don't cry. Stand up straight. Don't show weakness," held him still. His mouth opened, and to his own horror, he heard himself say, I don't know. I didn't see her until after." Miss Laverne's eyes didn't blink. They just sank, as though the light in them had been put out. She gave a faint nod. "I understand," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Gregory stepped between them, shielding Caleb. "Come on," he snapped at his son. "We're leaving." He offered no help to the woman on the floor. No second glance. Caleb stood slowly. His knees trembled. For a moment, his hand drifted back toward Miss Laverne, but he caught himself, dropped it, and followed his father silently down the hallway. Behind him, Miss Laverne remained still, her blood marking the cold tile floor like a quiet testimony. Outside, the late afternoon sun lit the parking lot in gold. The Mercedes waited. They drove in silence. Inside the car, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about her hands shaking, but still gentle, her eyes afraid, but still kind. The peppermint in his pocket felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. He had buried the truth, but it wouldn't stay buried. Not this time. If this story moved you, leave a like and comment where you're watching from. Who knows? Someone nearby might be watching too. The car ride home was heavy with silence. Gregory Whitmore's grip on the steering wheel was tight, the leather creaking faintly under his knuckles. The sun was starting to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the road, but inside the black Mercedes, the tension was suffocating. Caleb sat in the back seat, his face turned toward the window. His swollen eye throbbed with every heartbeat. The blood had dried stiff at the edge of his shirt collar, and the peppermint in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole into his thigh. He didn't dare look at his father, didn't dare speak. Gregory finally broke the silence. I don't want to hear another word about this at school. We'll handle it through the proper channels. The principal will be dealt with, and that woman, his voice hardened, will be fired. Caleb swallowed hard. She didn't. Don't. The word was flat, sharp. You already said what you saw. There's no need to second-guess yourself now. The words stung more than they should have. Caleb hadn't told the truth, and now, his lie was becoming law. They pulled into the circular driveway of their large, sterile home in Briar Hill, a quiet, high-income suburb 30 minutes outside the city. The house was perfect. Pristine hedges, stone steps that never cracked. Inside, nothing was ever out of place. And yet, Caleb had never felt more unraveled. Gregory stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks. Go inside and clean yourself up. I'll call Dr. Levin to check your eye. Caleb opened the car door slowly. Dad, Gregory paused, turning slightly. What? The boy hesitated. The words clawed at his throat. She was just trying to help. I'm fine, he muttered instead, and walked up the steps. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Caleb wandered past the spotless foyer, ignoring the distant hum of the central air. He headed straight for the upstairs bathroom. The mirror above the sink showed him the truth he couldn't speak. A bruise darkening beneath his eye, dried blood along his temple, and something worse in his gaze, shame. He turned on the water, letting it run hot. The steam rose quickly, curling at the edges of the mirror. He wet a washcloth, pressing it gently against his face, trying not to wince. As the blood lifted from his skin, he thought of her Miss Laverne. The way she had spoken to him, not like he was weak, not like he was broken, but like he mattered, like she saw him. Her hands had trembled, not out of guilt, but out of fear, and yet she had still shielded him. And what had he done? He had let his father knock her to the ground. He had watched her bleed, and then he had lied. A knock on the door made him jump. Caleb, it was Maria, the housekeeper. Dr. Levin's here. No. Caleb opened the door, eyes lowered. Okay. The doctor was already setting up in the living room, bag open, gloves on, all efficiency. Gregory stood nearby with his arms crossed. Bruising looks mild, Dr. Levin said after a few minutes. Surface cut. Could use an antibiotic, but no stitches needed. Caleb nodded quietly. He barely felt the sting of the cream. He barely heard the instructions. Later that night, alone in his room, he lay on top of the covers with the lights off. The moonlight poured through the window and lit the side of his dresser where his school sketch pad sat untouched. He got up slowly, sat at the edge of his desk, and opened it. On the first blank page, he began to draw. It wasn't detailed, just lines and shadows, but the figure that took shape was unmistakable. A woman kneeling on a school floor, a boy beside her, a blood-stained cloth in her hand, and behind them, a shadow looming large. He closed the sketch pad and hugged it to his chest. The peppermint still sat in his pocket, untouched. The next morning, breakfast passed in silence. Gregory read the Wall Street Journal while sipping black coffee. Caleb picked at scrambled eggs that had gone cold. I'll be at the firm late, his father said. The school board will get my report by noon. Caleb nodded, pushing the eggs around his plate. Gregory finally looked up. You're not eating. I'm not hungry. You need energy if you're going to heal. Caleb forced a bite and chewed slowly. His mind was far from the table. It was still in that hallway, with the thud of a skull against a locker, with the sound of someone begging him to tell the truth. On the way to school, he sat silently in the back seat of the car again. Same road, same trees. But everything felt different now. When they pulled up to the school, Gregory looked at his son in the rearview mirror. Remember, he said firmly, say nothing unless someone asks. This is already being handled. Caleb nodded, stepping out, but as he turned toward the front entrance, something caught his eye. Across the parking lot, behind a chain-link fence, stood Miss Laverne. Her hair was tied back, and a thin bandage curved along her temple. She wasn't in uniform, just a windbreaker and jeans. Her eyes found his immediately. She didn't smile, she didn't wave. She just looked at him, steady and quiet. Caleb stood frozen for a moment. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the peppermint, and gripped it tightly in his palm. He wasn't ready to speak yet, but he knew one thing. He had to. The morning passed in a blur. Caleb sat at his desk near the back of Mrs. Langley's classroom. The sounds of pencils scratching and chairs shifting fading into a low hum. His good eye darted occasionally toward the window, where sunlight filtered through blinds in sharp slats across the floor. The bruise around his swollen eye had deepened into a purplish blue, and the whispers hadn't stopped since he walked through the door. They say his dad's a lawyer. Kicked the janitor or something. Blood on the floor, I heard. He kept his head down. No one sat beside him. No one offered to. Even the kids who usually begged to borrow his colored pencils kept their distance now. At recess, he found a corner behind the art building, where the wind blew loose leaves across the pavement. He took out the peppermint again and held it in his hand, its wrapper crinkled but unopened. He couldn't bring himself to eat it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Footsteps approached. Caleb quickly shoved the candy into his pocket, heart racing until he saw who it was. Mrs. Helen, the school nurse, knelt in front of him with a small smile. She was in her 60s, wore round glasses on the tip of her nose, and always smelled faintly of eucalyptus. "I figured I might find you hiding," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. "I heard about what happened. You all right, sweetheart?" He shrugged. "My eye's okay. I wasn't talking about your eye." Caleb said nothing. His fingers picked at the stitching of his jacket sleeve. Mrs. Helen gave him a moment before continuing. "You know, Miss Laverne's been working here longer than any of the teachers. Most of the kids don't know this, but she saved a student's life once. 2 years ago. Little girl was choking in the lunchroom. Teachers froze, but Laverne knew what to do. Saved her right there, in front of everyone." Caleb's head snapped toward her. "She did?" Mrs. Helen nodded. "But she never made a fuss about it. That's just who she is. Quiet hero." A lump rose in Caleb's throat. "I thought you should know," she added softly, giving his knee a gentle pat, "just in case you forgot." When she walked away, Caleb sat frozen, the weight of her words pressing heavy against his chest. That night, after dinner, Gregory disappeared into his home office as usual. The dark oak door shut with a firm click, and Caleb was left in the kitchen with Maria, the housekeeper, who quietly cleared the plates. Caleb wandered into the living room and stood in front of the fireplace. The family portraits above the mantel showed a different version of life, one with a smiling mother who had passed when he was 6, and a younger, warmer version of the father he now barely recognized. On the coffee table sat his sketchpad. He picked it up and returned to the page he'd started the night before, the one with Miss Laverne kneeling beside him. Slowly, carefully, he added more detail. A line for her bandana, shadows for her eyes, the outline of his own hunched shoulders beside her. The sound of a door creaking open startled him. He quickly closed the sketchpad. Gregory entered, still on a call, holding his phone between shoulder and ear. His tone was clipped, businesslike. "I don't care what the union says. I want her gone by end of week," he said, walking into the kitchen. "No more delays. I'm not letting some janitor ruin my name." Caleb's heart dropped. He waited until the door closed again, and the muffled sound of his father's voice faded behind it. Then, with a shaky breath, he pulled a clean sheet of paper from his sketchpad. He began to write. "Dear Miss Laverne, I'm sorry I didn't speak up. I was scared, not of you. Of him." He paused, biting the end of the pencil. "You didn't do anything wrong. You helped me when nobody else did. I should have told the truth." He folded the letter once, carefully, then twice. He tucked it into the back of his sketchpad and hid it beneath his mattress. The next morning, he stared at himself in the bathroom mirror. His eye looked worse, but his voice didn't tremble when he said aloud, "I have to fix this." At school, he walked through the front entrance with a different kind of weight. Not fear, not quite courage. Something between them. A sense of responsibility he couldn't shake. Miss Laverne wasn't there. Not in the hallway. Not by the cafeteria. Not near the stairwell where she usually swept. He asked the secretary at the front desk if she had come in. The woman frowned. "I believe she's been suspended, sweetheart, pending an investigation." Caleb's stomach turned. His fingers curled around the edge of the counter. That afternoon, instead of taking the bus home, he stayed behind. He slipped out through the back gym doors and walked across the parking lot, around the corner, and down a narrow alley that led to the service entrance. The staff sometimes exited there after hours. He waited. Minutes passed. He almost gave up until he saw her. Miss Laverne came out, clutching a paper bag. Her windbreaker zipped up to her neck. A faint bruise peeked beneath her scarf, and her eyes were distant, guarded. "Miss Laverne," he called. She stopped. Her face tightened. "Caleb, I needed to see you," he said, approaching slowly. She looked at him, unreadable. "You already did, baby, and I remember exactly what you said." He lowered his gaze. "I lied. I didn't mean to. I was scared." Silence. She turned to leave, but he stepped in front of her, pulling the folded letter from his jacket. "I wrote this. It's not much, but it's the truth." Her eyes scanned his face, then the letter, then him again. Slowly, cautiously, she took the paper. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he whispered, "but I needed you to know." She didn't speak, just nodded once, a deep, slow movement that seemed to come from somewhere heavy inside her. Then she walked away, the paper clutched in her hand. Miss Laverne didn't read the letter right away. She carried it home like something fragile, folded carefully, tucked inside the inner pocket of her coat, right over her heart. The walk from Willow Creek Elementary to her small apartment complex took 20 minutes, but that evening, it felt longer, heavier. The setting sun bled orange into the sky, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks and rusted fences. Her legs ached, but she didn't hurry. When she reached her building, she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and let herself in. The apartment was quiet, warm but modest. A faded recliner in the corner. A small kitchen with peeling linoleum. On the wall hung 2 pictures, one of her late husband in uniform, and another of a girl in cap and gown. Her daughter, Maria, now working as a nurse across the state. Laverne removed her coat, hung it neatly, then sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the letter. The words were simple, honest, childlike, but not childish. She read it once, then again. By the 3rd time, her fingers trembled. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the kind of ache that lives beneath the ribs, a grief she'd carried too long. She had seen the fear in Caleb's eyes that day. It wasn't the kind of fear a child has of strangers. It was fear of his own father's disappointment, of failing some impossible version of strength. She had known that fear, intimately. The next morning, she folded the letter again and placed it gently inside her Bible, between the pages of Psalm 82. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. It wasn't absolution, but it was enough for now. Back at Willow Creek, Caleb sat in the principal's office, legs swinging nervously under the stiff wooden chair. Mr. Darnell, the principal, was a balding man with a clipped mustache and a nervous twitch in his left eye. He shifted in his seat, tapping a pencil against his notepad. "Caleb," he said slowly, "your father called this morning. He's quite upset." Caleb nodded, eyes down. "I've reviewed the security footage," Mr. Darnell continued. "It confirms part of your story. We saw Miss Laverne kneeling next to you, offering first aid, but there's no footage of the incident before you were injured." Caleb's heart pounded. "I need to ask again," the principal said, leaning forward. "Did Miss Laverne hurt you in any way?" "No," Caleb said, louder than he meant to, then softer. "No, sir, she didn't." The principal blinked. "I see. That contradicts the statement from your father." Caleb hesitated. "I lied." The room fell silent. Mr. Darnell sat back slowly. "Why?" "Because I was scared," Caleb whispered. "Not of her, of him." The principal looked at the boy for a long moment, then exhaled. "Thank you for telling me. I know that wasn't easy." He stood and walked to the window, hands behind his back. "Your father's influence here, it's significant. But the truth matters, Caleb, no matter who's watching." After a pause, he turned. "I'll speak with the superintendent. Miss Laverne's suspension will be reviewed." Caleb nodded, a weight loosening in his chest but not disappearing. Not yet. Later that afternoon, Gregory Whitmore arrived at the school. He strode through the halls like a man accustomed to control, to deference. Teachers stepped aside. Office staff lowered their voices. When he entered the principal's office, Mr. Darnell stood, stiff but polite. "Mr. Whitmore, thank you for coming." Gregory didn't waste time. I assume you've acted on the matter. That woman should be permanently removed from the premises. Mr. Darnell cleared his throat. Actually, your son came forward this morning. He admitted he lied. Gregory's expression darkened. Excuse me? He said Miss Laverne didn't harm him, that she helped him. Security footage supports his claim. For a moment, Gregory said nothing. The room grew colder. My son is a child. He doesn't always know what's best. Perhaps, Mr. Darnell replied gently, but sometimes children recognize truth faster than adults. Gregory's jaw tightened. Are you implying something? I'm saying Miss Laverne's record is spotless, and if a mistake was made here, it wasn't hers. Gregory stood rigid, eyes flickering with something between disbelief and indignation. He opened his mouth to speak, but then Caleb entered the room. The boy walked in quietly, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. He didn't look at his father. I asked to be here, he said. Gregory blinked. Caleb, you were wrong, Caleb said softly. She didn't hurt me. I was scared you'd be mad at me for crying, for getting hurt. That's why I didn't tell the truth. Gregory's mouth opened, then closed again. She's the reason I'm okay, Caleb continued. Not you, not anyone else. His voice didn't rise, but every word struck like a bell. I thought being strong meant not crying, he said, but she said it means standing up when it's hard. Gregory stared at him, something flickering behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet acceptance, but something beginning to crack. Mr. Darnell cleared his throat. We'd like to reinstate Miss Laverne, with your approval or without it, but I thought it fair to inform you personally. Gregory didn't respond. He just looked at his son, seeing not the bruises but the resolve beneath them. And for the first time, he had no words. That evening, the Whitmore house was unusually still. Gregory stood in his home office, one hand on the window pane, the other clutching a glass of bourbon that remained untouched. Outside, the sky was bruised with dusk, casting long shadows across the immaculate lawn, but inside his chest, shadows had already formed. He hadn't spoken a word to Caleb since they'd left the principal's office. He had barely looked at the boy, too jarred by the confrontation. The words still echoed. She's the reason I'm okay, not you. Gregory had always prided himself on control, on order. He had built his law firm from nothing, argued landmark cases, and been celebrated in glossy magazines. He knew how to manage people, crisis, image, but this was different. His son had stood in front of him and told him he had failed. Across the hall, Caleb sat in his room, legs pulled up against his chest, staring at the sketchpad in his lap. He had drawn nothing since the day before. Every page felt too heavy to touch. The scene played over and over in his head, his father shouting, Miss Laverne bleeding, her voice breaking as she begged him to speak the truth. And then, his own betrayal. His chest still ached with it. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small plastic container of crayons, some broken, some worn down to stubs, and pulled out a blue one. On a fresh page, he began to sketch the hallway again. This time, he drew it empty. Just lockers, shadows, a single drop of red on the floor. The loneliness of it made his stomach twist. Downstairs, Maria, the housekeeper, knocked gently on the study door. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly, I made supper. He didn't answer. Maria hesitated, then added, Caleb hasn't eaten. Gregory's jaw flexed. I'll talk to him. She left without another word. Gregory stared into the glass in his hand. The bourbon reflected the light from the desk lamp, golden and still. He set it down, untouched. Moments later, he knocked on Caleb's bedroom door. Yeah? The boy answered softly. Gregory opened the door and stepped inside. He looked out of place in the pale blue room, too sharp, too stern against the scattered comic books and plastic model airplanes. Caleb didn't look up from his drawing. Gregory cleared his throat. I didn't expect that, what you said, in the office. Caleb kept sketching. I meant it. I know, Gregory said, and you were right. That made Caleb pause. Slowly, he turned to face his father. Gregory stepped further in and sat awkwardly on the edge of the bed. His voice was quieter now, not the courtroom tone, but something stripped back. I thought I was teaching you how to be strong. Not to cry. To fight back. I didn't see how much I wasn't showing you. Caleb studied his face. His eyes were tired, the lines at the corners deeper than usual. I was scared of you, Caleb admitted. I still kind of am. Gregory nodded, a muscle in his jaw jumping. That's not the kind of father I ever wanted to be. There was silence between them for a moment. Then Caleb reached into his nightstand and pulled out the peppermint. She gave me this, he said, even when she was bleeding, even after you hurt her. Gregory's eyes dropped to the candy. His voice cracked for the first time in years. I shouldn't have touched her. I lost my temper. I assumed too much. She didn't just help me, Dad. She listened to me. Nobody else even saw me. Gregory looked away, ashamed. I want to see her, Caleb said. Gregory didn't argue. Then we will. The next afternoon, they drove across town to the apartment complex listed in Miss Laverne's employee file. It was older, the paint faded, the railing rusted in places. Gregory helped Caleb out of the car, and together they walked to the third floor. He knocked once, then again. The door opened slowly. Miss Laverne stood there in a plain sweater and jeans, her hair wrapped in a headscarf. The bruise on her temple was fading, but still visible. She looked at Caleb first, then at Gregory. Neither of them spoke at first. I'm sorry, Caleb blurted. I should have said it sooner. You didn't deserve what happened. Miss Laverne's face softened. Baby, she said. You were scared. It's all right. Gregory cleared his throat. Miss Laverne, I owe you an apology. A real one. What I did was inexcusable. She studied him for a long, quiet moment. You've got a good boy, she said finally. All he needed was someone to see him. Gregory lowered his gaze. I see that now. You can come in if you want, she added. I've got sweet tea and leftover peach cobbler. Caleb smiled, eyes lighting up. They stepped inside, into a modest but warm home. Family photos lined the hallway. A record player sat in the corner. Old jazz humming low in the background. The scent of cinnamon filled the air. Gregory stood still for a moment, as if unsure how to belong in a space like this. Miss Laverne handed Caleb a plate with a slice of cobbler. Still warm, she said. As Caleb sat at the kitchen table, Gregory remained near the door. You know, Laverne said, pouring sweet tea into two mismatched glasses, strength don't mean silence, Mr. Whitmore, and it don't mean standing above people. Sometimes it's knowing when to kneel. Gregory nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand that. And for the first time in years, as Caleb took a bite and smiled, Gregory felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Peace. It had been a long time since Caleb had felt the kind of quiet that didn't weigh on his chest. As he sat in Miss Laverne's kitchen, his legs swinging lightly beneath the table, he let the warmth of peach cobbler melt on his tongue. It was sweet, buttery, and spiced just enough to make his toes wiggle in his shoes. Across the table, Miss Laverne poured him a second glass of sweet tea. Her movements were calm, unhurried, like someone who had learned long ago how to move through a world that never rushed to make room for her. The yellow-tinted light from the ceiling fixture bathed everything in a soft gold. Caleb watched the dust motes drift slowly in the air and felt, for the first time in a while, safe. Gregory Whitmore sat to the side, arms crossed, his back stiff in the wooden chair too small for his frame. He hadn't touched his tea, though he nodded politely when Miss Laverne offered it. His eyes, usually so direct and calculating, flickered occasionally toward his son. The calm in the boy's shoulders, the way he smiled, these were things Gregory didn't recognize, or perhaps had forgotten. Where'd you learn to make cobbler like this? Caleb asked, his voice more alive than it had been in weeks. Miss Laverne chuckled softly. My mama taught me when I was not much older than you. She said, sugar don't just sweeten your mouth, it softens your heart. I think she was right. Caleb grinned. She was. Gregory finally spoke. Miss Laverne, He cleared his throat. I didn't come just to apologize. I wanted to ask if you'd consider returning to the school. Mr. Darnell and I both agree you were wrongfully suspended. The board will reinstate you if you're willing. She raised her eyebrows. The board'll do that, huh? Gregory nodded. They're drafting a formal apology. From me as well. Laverne leaned back in her chair. It's not about the apology, Mr. Whitmore. I've cleaned floors and wiped blood off locker handles for 27 years. I've been called names, ignored, looked down on, but I always stayed for the kids. That boy right there? She gestured gently to Caleb. He reminded me why I started. Gregory glanced at his son, the words landing somewhere deeper than he expected. Would you go back? Caleb asked, his voice tentative, hopeful. Miss Laverne gave him a look full of affection. If I do, it's for you. Not for the board. And definitely not for your daddy. She smiled lightly. Gregory allowed the corner of his mouth to twitch, a kind of truce. Outside, the sky had shifted from gold to lavender. Caleb helped clear the dishes, and Miss Laverne insisted he keep the last piece of cobbler for later. As they stood by the door preparing to leave, Caleb turned and looked at her, a little more serious now. Miss Laverne, he said, what if I mess up again? You will, she said simply, pulling his jacket collar straight. We all do. He looked down. Even good people? Especially good people. But the good ones learn. They get back up, and they try better. He nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. I'm gonna try better. That's all I need to hear, baby. Gregory extended his hand toward her. This time, she shook it. On the way home, the car ride wasn't silent like before. Caleb talked about school, his drawings, a class project he had ignored for a week. Gregory listened. Really listened. Even asked questions. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. When they pulled into the driveway, Caleb turned before getting out. Dad? Yeah? Can we go see her again? Like, not just for school stuff. Just visit. Gregory hesitated, then smiled faintly. We'll make it a Sunday thing. Caleb nodded, pleased, then ran inside. Gregory stayed behind, sitting in the car alone for a few moments. He looked out over the pristine lawn, the rows of clipped hedges, the stone steps that gleamed under porch lights. For years, he had built this house like a fortress, meant to protect, to shield, to prove. But inside those walls, a boy had learned to fear the man who claimed to protect him. Tonight, something small had changed. Upstairs, Caleb laid the last piece of peach cobbler on a napkin and placed it beside his bed. He didn't want to eat it right away. He just wanted it there close. Then he opened his sketch pad and began a new drawing. This one wasn't of pain. It wasn't even of a person. He drew a bench, a plate of cobbler, a peppermint candy with its wrapper half opened, and two hands, one small, one older, reaching out. Not quite touching, but almost. In the center of the page, with blocky, careful letters, he wrote, "Strength doesn't mean silence." He stared at it for a while, then whispered aloud into the stillness of his room, "I think I get it now." Oh, and for the first night in weeks, Caleb slept soundly with a peppermint under his pillow, and the truth, finally, in the open air. The following week unfolded like a slow exhale. The tension that had wrapped itself around Caleb's chest had begun to loosen, thread by thread. Though his eye was still swollen, and whispers still floated through the halls of Willow Creek Elementary, something had changed. Miss Laverne was back. Her first day reinstated was quiet, but not without notice. She wore her usual navy uniform, her shoes freshly polished, her posture upright. There was no grand return, no announcement over the intercom, just the familiar sound of her mop bucket wheels echoing through the morning hallway, like a steady heartbeat restoring rhythm to the school. Caleb watched her from the other end of the corridor. She glanced up and saw him, offering a small nod. He nodded back. That was all it took. In Mrs. Langley's classroom, the desks had been arranged for group projects. Caleb was assigned to a team with two classmates, Emma and Deshawn. Normally, he kept quiet during group work, but that day, he surprised them both by offering to lead the poster design. You draw? Deshawn asked, skeptical. A little, Caleb replied, pulling out his sketch pad. He flipped to a blank page and began sketching the outline of their assigned topic, a tree representing different cultures. His hands moved with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't ask for attention but quietly earned respect. Emma leaned in. Whoa, that's actually really good. Caleb smiled without looking up. Thanks. For the first time in what felt like forever, the table wasn't filled with whispers about him, just work, laughter, normalcy. At lunch, he passed Miss Laverne in the hallway again. She was wiping a smudge off a trophy case. Caleb hesitated, then walked up to her. Hi, he said, shifting from foot to foot. Hey there, she replied warmly. How's the eye? Better. Still kinda gross looking. She chuckled. Gives you character. They stood in silence for a moment. Students walked by, chatting, laughing. No one paid them much attention. I've been drawing, Caleb said softly. Stuff you said. I've been trying to remember it. Miss Laverne glanced at him. That so? He nodded. And I wrote something. Like a story. About what happened. Her face softened. You gonna share it with anyone? Not yet, he admitted. But maybe. Well, she said, straightening up. When you're ready, I'd be proud to read it. He smiled and continued to the cafeteria. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Principal Darnell met with Superintendent Willis, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and a sharper memory. I've reviewed the final report, she said, folding her hands. Miss Laverne's reinstatement stands. Gregory Whitmore submitted a formal apology, and the board has accepted it. But I want you to know if this school had failed to protect that woman, I would have raised hell myself. Darnell cleared his throat. Understood. Too many people like her do the quiet work, she continued. The unseen work, and they're the first ones blamed, the last ones defended. I'm glad this boy had the courage to correct the record. He's a good kid, Darnell said. Scared, but good. Most brave people are scared, she replied. That's what makes them brave. Later that week, a small community newsletter printed a short piece. Custodian returns to school after misunderstanding, praised by students and staff alike. There were no photos, just a paragraph and a quote from Caleb. She helped me when nobody else did. Miss Laverne didn't ask for a copy, but someone taped it to her locker anyway. She didn't take it down. On Sunday, Gregory kept his word. He and Caleb returned to Miss Laverne's apartment with a store-bought apple pie, Gregory's idea. Awkward but sincere. Caleb also brought a drawing, her standing in front of the trophy case, mop in hand, her reflection in the glass showing something taller, brighter, a woman in armor. She looked at it for a long time. Is that how you see me? That's how you are, he said. She framed the drawing and hung it in her hallway, across from the photo of her late husband. That night, back home, Gregory poured himself a glass of water instead of bourbon. He sat on the back porch, listening to the wind rustle through the oak trees. Caleb joined him a few minutes later, barefoot and wrapped in a blanket. They sat in silence, not because they didn't know what to say, but because, for once, the silence didn't hurt. You still think crying makes you weak? Gregory asked quietly. Caleb shook his head. Not anymore. Gregory looked straight ahead. I used to think that too. Caleb glanced up at him. What changed? Gregory took a slow breath. You did. And beneath the stars, father and son sat side by side, not as mirror images, not as man and boy, but as two people learning how to speak the same language again. The second Sunday visit to Miss Laverne's apartment came with unexpected ease. Gregory Whitmore, once the very definition of restraint and formality, now carried a foil-covered tray of baked ziti in both hands. It wasn't homemade. He'd picked it up from a local Italian deli after Maria insisted he couldn't show up empty-handed again, but there was something different in his posture. Less armor, more presence. Caleb, walking just a step ahead, had a bounce in his stride. He wore a shirt with paint flecks, still clinging to the hem, and under his arm he carried his sketch pad, dog-eared and thickening with new pages. As they reached the third floor, Caleb knocked softly. Miss Laverne opened the door with a knowing smile. Well now, she said, tilting her head at the dish. Either y'all trying to bribe me, or someone's aiming for a spot in my will. Gregory let out a dry chuckle. We come bearing pasta and humility. Then you're both welcome, she replied, stepping aside to let them in. Her apartment, though small, always smelled like something lived in. Today it was lavender oil, simmering on the old radiator, and the faint remnants of a lemon-scented floor cleaner. Caleb set his sketch pad down on the coffee table and made himself at home on the recliner. Gregory stood by the counter, unsure of his place again. Laverne noticed. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. You're not in court. He nodded and took the chair across from her, stiff at first but slowly easing back. As they ate, conversation unfolded gently. Books, weather, neighborhood gossip. Miss Laverne told a story about a neighbor who'd tried to grill ribs on his balcony and ended up setting off the building's sprinklers. Caleb laughed so hard he nearly dropped his fork. Midway through the meal, Caleb opened his sketch pad and turned it toward her. I drew you again. This time, she was standing in front of a chalkboard, children seated around her, their eyes turned up toward her like she was telling a story. A soft light came from behind her, casting her shadow large across the floor. The chalk in her hand read, in big bold letters, "Kindness teaches louder than fear." Miss Laverne's voice caught in her throat. "You've got a gift, baby." Caleb looked down, embarrassed but proud. Gregory studied the image, then looked at his son. "You've never shown me your drawings." Caleb shrugged. "I didn't think you'd care." The words hung in the air longer than either of them expected. "I should have," Gregory said quietly. "I do now." After lunch, Miss Laverne poured tea and brought out an old photo album. "You want stories? I'll give you stories." Inside were yellowed photographs. Some black and white. Some faded Polaroids. One showed her as a teenager, arms crossed and smirking next to a 1972nd Chevy Caprice. Another showed her and her husband on their wedding day, dancing barefoot on a porch somewhere in Georgia. "That's your daughter?" Gregory asked, pointing to a photo of a young woman in nursing scrubs. Laverne beamed. "Maria. Works upstate at a clinic. Raised her alone after her daddy passed. Thought I was tough before? Nothing like raising a teenage girl in a one-bedroom apartment." Gregory smiled. "You must be proud." "Proud, don't begin to cover it." There was a pause. Then Gregory asked carefully, "Do you ever feel like the world still expects you to stay small? Invisible?" Laverne looked at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Every day," she said. "But I got tired of shrinking. Tired of teaching people how to treat me by letting them step over me." She sipped her tea, then added, "But that day in the hallway, when you grabbed me, I shrank again. Just for a minute." Gregory lowered his gaze. "I've replayed it more times than I can count." "I don't need you to punish yourself," she said. "I just need you to remember it, and do better." He nodded. "I will." Later, as the sun dipped low, casting amber light through the kitchen window, Gregory and Caleb stood to leave. At the door, Miss Laverne looked down at Caleb. "You all right, baby?" Caleb hesitated. "Sometimes I still get scared. Like, if I ever mess up again, things will go back." "They won't," she said, "because you changed the ending." Gregory extended his hand, and she took it. This time there was no tension, just understanding. Driving home, Caleb stared out the window. "She said I changed the ending." "You did," Gregory replied. Then, after a long pause, "So did I, or I'm trying." Caleb turned toward him. "Do you think people like us ever really change?" Gregory kept his eyes on the road. "Not overnight. But one decision at a time? Yeah, I think we can." That night, Caleb added one final image to his sketchpad. It was of a hallway, a boy with a bruised eye standing tall, a woman beside him with a mop, and behind them, a man in a suit, not angry, not looming, but quiet, learning. At the bottom, he wrote, "A new ending begins with a better choice." The next Friday at Willow Creek Elementary brought more than just the end of the week. It brought Parent Appreciation Day, a tradition the school had kept alive since the 90 seconds. Students were encouraged to invite their parents or guardians for a few hours of classroom activities, music, and a catered lunch in the gymnasium. The halls were decorated with construction paper hearts, glittery banners, and crookedly drawn family portraits taped to classroom doors. For most students, the day was a cause for excitement. For Caleb, it was complicated. He stood beside his desk, watching other students beam as their moms and dads walked in, mothers in business suits, fathers in jeans and polos. There was laughter, hugs, even the occasional balloon bouquet. Mrs. Langley called out, "All right, everyone. If your grown-up is here, go ahead and sit with them. We'll get started with our art showcase." Caleb turned toward the classroom door just as it opened, but instead of his father, it was Miss Laverne. She stepped in, her uniform replaced with a neat blue blouse and slacks. Her shoes were still plain, but polished. She carried a manila folder under her arm and wore a slight, careful smile. Caleb blinked. "You came?" "I had a few minutes," she said, lowering her voice. "Someone told me a certain artist was showing his work today. Mrs. Langley looked over, surprised for a moment, then smiled. "Well, Miss Laverne, we're happy to have you. Vi." Some of the parents glanced curiously in her direction. A few exchanged quiet comments. Caleb didn't care. His heart thudded with pride. He pulled out a chair beside him. "You can sit here." She eased into the seat, brushing invisible lint off her blouse. A boy nearby whispered, "Isn't she the janitor?" Caleb heard it. So did Laverne, but neither reacted. Instead, he turned to her and whispered, "You ready for my drawings?" "Born ready," she replied. He pulled his sketch pad from his backpack and laid it on the desk between them. Page after page flipped sketches of the school, his classmates, a teacher holding a globe. And then, toward the back, came the ones she hadn't seen. One was of the hallway where they first met. Another was of her handing him the peppermint. But the most recent one, dated just yesterday, showed her standing in the center of the cafeteria, her arms raised like a conductor, guiding chaos into calm. "That one's my favorite," Caleb whispered. Laverne touched the edge of the page. "Mine too." Mrs. Langley began announcing students by row to come up and talk about their artwork. When Caleb's turn came, he hesitated. Then he stood, sketchpad in hand, and walked to the front of the class. "My name's Caleb Whitmore," he began, "and most of my drawings are about people, but not superheroes or famous people, just regular ones, the ones that don't get noticed much." "Doe." He opened to the drawing of Miss Laverne holding a mop like a sword, standing guard outside a classroom door. "This is Miss Laverne," he said. "She works here, but she doesn't just clean. She sees things most people don't, like kids who are scared or when something isn't right." Laverne sat motionless. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. Caleb looked around the room. "A while ago, something bad happened to me, and she was the only one who helped. She didn't ask for anything. She just stayed. There was silence. No whispers. No giggles. Just stillness. She's my friend," Caleb said finally. "And she's one of the strongest people I know." Mrs. Langley's eyes glistened behind her glasses. "Thank you, Caleb. That was beautiful." He returned to his seat. Miss Laverne reached for his hand under the desk and gave it a gentle squeeze. After the presentation, the students and guests moved to the gym for lunch. Long tables were lined with trays of sandwiches, cookies, lemonade, and fruit cups. Folding chairs creaked under shifting bodies, and the buzz of small talk filled the space. Gregory arrived 20 minutes late. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit with no tie, sleeves slightly rolled up. His hair was neatly combed, but his expression was tight, wary. As he scanned the room, his eyes fell on Caleb seated at a corner table. Across from him sat Miss Laverne. Gregory approached slowly. Caleb looked up and waved. "Hey, Dad." Gregory nodded, then turned to Laverne. "Miss Laverne." "Mr. Whitmore," she replied evenly. There was a long pause. Then Gregory extended a small white box from under his arm. "From Grady's Bakery. I hear you like their pecan tarts." She blinked, caught off guard. "I do." He placed it on the table. "Consider it a thank you for being here and for showing up when I didn't." She nodded. "Thank you." Gregory sat beside Caleb and began fixing a sandwich from the tray in front of them. They ate in near silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable, the kind of quiet where words weren't necessary. Caleb passed Miss Laverne a cookie. She offered him a napkin. Gregory refilled everyone's lemonade. At one point, a parent at the next table leaned over. "Isn't that the janitor?" Gregory looked him in the eye and said simply, "No. That's Miss Laverne Johnson. She works here. And she's family." "Zero." Caleb beamed. That night, back at home, Caleb sat at his desk, sketchpad open. He drew 3 figures at a lunch table: a boy, a woman, and a man in a suit. No titles, no labels, just connection. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Family isn't always who you come from. Sometimes it's who stays when things fall apart." The morning after Parent Appreciation Day, the school buzzed with murmurs, not just about Caleb's speech, but about the quiet, steady presence of Miss Laverne beside him. A few teachers exchanged looks in the break room, surprised by how comfortable she'd seemed, seated next to one of the most influential men in town. One aide even admitted she'd never heard anyone call Miss Laverne by her full name before, just the janitor, or worse, nothing at all. But today, It was different. At recess, Caleb sat under the oak tree near the edge of the playground, the same spot he used to hide in during lunch. This time, he wasn't hiding. He was drawing. He had nearly finished sketching the lunch table from yesterday, a triangle of faces, all different, but warm. It was his first attempt at capturing a real moment of peace. The page felt lighter. "Is that me?" Caleb looked up to see Deshawn standing over him, a soccer ball tucked under one arm. "Yeah," Caleb said, flipping the sketch pad slightly. "You're in the background. Kinda blurry." Deshawn squinted at the page. "I look cool. You look like you're about to fall." "Bullant." Deshawn laughed and sat beside him. "So, yesterday, that thing you said about Miss Laverne? That was brave." Caleb didn't respond right away. "I was just telling the truth." "Still brave. Most kids wouldn't have." Caleb shrugged, but he smiled a little. Deshawn nudged him with his elbow. "You want to come play?" Caleb blinked. "Soccer?" "Yeah, we're short one." Caleb hesitated, then closed the sketch pad and stood. "Sure." They ran off toward the field. Miss Laverne watched from the window near the supply closet, mop in hand, a quiet smile blooming on her lips. For the first time in weeks, she saw Caleb running not away from something, not hiding but running toward something. Meanwhile, across town, Gregory sat in his office at Whitmore and Associates, staring out the window. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone. His assistant had placed a pile of case files on his desk, but he hadn't opened them. Instead, he held a manila envelope in his hand, the kind used for personnel reviews and formal complaints. Inside was the original report he had submitted to the school board about Miss Laverne. He'd written it in anger, in pride, in fear, and now every word felt like a weight on his chest. He pulled the sheet out and reread the first line. "An unauthorized staff member was found in inappropriate contact with my son." Gregory leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. There was a knock. He looked up to see Anna, his assistant, standing in the doorway. "Mr. Whitmore, there's someone here to see you." "From the city paper." He frowned. "About what?" She said it's a human interest piece. About the Parent Day speech. She wants to talk about the janitor. He blinked. "I told her you weren't taking press right now, but—" "No," Gregory interrupted, standing. "It's all right. Let her in." "Nah." Moments later, a young reporter with curly hair and a tan leather notebook stepped inside. She introduced herself quickly, then got to the point. "We've had a lot of community response to the student speech at Willow Creek," she said. "It's rare to see that kind of attention, especially directed at a support staff member." Gregory nodded slowly. "I can imagine. Some people were surprised to see you at her side." Gregory's voice was calm. "I was surprised too. And, The reporter paused, scribbled. "Would you say your view of her changed?" He took a breath. "My view of a lot of things changed." There was a long pause. "You mind if I quote you on that?" He looked her in the eye. "Make sure you spell her name right. Laverne Johnson." The next day, the piece ran online. The headline was simple: "The Janitor Who Stayed. One boy's voice, one town's reckoning." There was no scandal, no bitterness, just a story of quiet heroism, a child's courage, and a man learning to listen. At school, Caleb overheard two teachers talking in the hallway. "I didn't even know she had a first name," one said. "I'm just glad someone finally said it out loud," the other replied. Miss Laverne didn't say much when she saw the article printed and taped to the staff bulletin board. She just touched the corner of the page gently with one finger, then continued down the hallway, pushing her mop bucket. That night, Caleb sat in his room, sketchpad in his lap. He drew a hallway, not empty this time, but filled with shadows of people walking by. In the center stood a woman with a mop. Only this time, her reflection in the floor was different. It showed a woman holding a lantern. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, "The ones who light the way aren't always the ones who get seen, but they're the ones who lead." The following week, something unexpected happened at Willow Creek Elementary. During the Monday morning announcements usually reserved for birthdays, lost items, and PTA fundraisers, Principal Darnell cleared his throat and added a name to the loudspeaker. "And a special thank you to Miss Laverne Johnson for her years of dedicated service to this school and its students. Your kindness has not gone unnoticed." A pause. Then the bell rang. It was only a sentence, one line. But to those who had never heard her name through the intercom before, it landed with quiet force. Miss Laverne was in the cafeteria when she heard it, wiping down a lunch table, one hand bracing her lower back. She froze, cloth in hand, and turned toward the ceiling speaker. Around her, a few fifth graders clapped without being prompted. Others looked at her with new eyes. She nodded once to herself and went back to work. But her hands moved slower now, careful, reverent. Caleb heard it too, from room 204. He looked up from his spelling worksheet, eyes wide, then turned to Deshawn. "She got mentioned," he whispered. Deshawn grinned. Took them long enough. At recess, Caleb made a detour from the field and headed for the janitor's closet. Miss Laverne was organizing supplies on the shelf when she saw him peek in. "You heard it?" he asked. "I did. You okay?" She smiled. "I've been doing this job for 27 years, baby. First time I ever got my name said over the school speakers. Took a child to do it." Caleb shuffled his feet. "They should have done it a long time ago." "Well," she said, "we ain't always responsible for when people see us. Just how we carry ourselves while they don't." He nodded slowly. "That's kind of deep. I've had time to rehearse it." Later that day, the art teacher, Miss Holland, stopped Caleb after class. She held up one of his drawings, a sketch of the school hallway with students walking past Miss Laverne, none of them noticing her, though she stood right in the center. "This is powerful," she said. "Have you ever thought about submitting this to the district's student art showcase?" Caleb blinked. "No." "Well, I think you should. And there's a theme this year, who inspires you. Seems like it fits." Caleb hesitated. "What if they don't get it?" Miss Holland smiled. "Sometimes the best art is the kind that makes people uncomfortable first, then makes them think." He took the form home that night. At dinner, he slid it across the table to his father. Gregory read it twice. "You want to submit this?" "Yeah." "What happens if it gets picked?" "They put it on display at the district gallery downtown, and there's a reception." Gregory leaned back in his chair. "All right, let's fill it out." "No arguments?" Caleb asked, half joking. Gregory smiled, signing the bottom. "No arguments." Caleb sent the drawing in the next day. 2 weeks later, he got the letter. His piece had been selected. The district gallery, housed in a converted train station downtown, hosted a weekend event that drew students, teachers, and families from across the county. Art pieces lined the old brick walls, paintings, collages, sculptures, but in the center of the room, framed in glass, hung Caleb's drawing. At the bottom, a printed plaque read, "The Ones We Walk Past" by Caleb Whitmore, grade 5. Caleb stood in front of it in a clean collared shirt and blazer that didn't quite fit his shoulders. Gregory stood beside him, straighter than usual. Across the gallery, Miss Laverne entered. Wearing a soft gray dress and a pair of shoes she only pulled out for church or weddings, she moved through the crowd with humility, head slightly bowed, until she reached the drawing. She stopped, stared. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned to Caleb. "You see me?" "Yeah," he said softly. "I do." She touched his shoulder. "That's enough for me." Reporters took a few photos. One featured Caleb standing in front of his artwork, with Gregory on one side and Miss Laverne on the other. No one in the photo wore a title. No suits. No uniforms. Just presence. Back home that night, Caleb placed the event program beside his sketch pad. As he prepared for bed, Gregory knocked lightly on the door. "Hey," he said, "can I come in?" "Sure." Gregory stepped inside, holding something behind his back. "I wanted to give you something." He revealed a small wooden frame inside it, Caleb's drawing of Miss Laverne holding the lantern, the original, carefully preserved. "I had it matted," Gregory said. "Thought maybe we could hang it somewhere together." Caleb stared at it. "Where?" "I was thinking, the study." "No." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Your study? It's our house. Why not put something true on the wall?" Caleb smiled, for real this time. "Okay." They walked together into the hallway, Gregory holding the hammer, Caleb holding the nail. And as they stood side by side, father and son, preparing to hang a drawing that used to live only in a child's mind, they carved a space for truth, for change, for the quiet light of someone who had once been walked past, but never again unseen. It had been nearly a month since Caleb's drawing had gone up in the district gallery. but its impact still lingered like morning mist that refused to burn off. The whispers about Miss Laverne had faded not because people forgot, but because they had finally begun to look at her. Really look. Now, when she walked down the hall with her mop and bucket, students greeted her by name. Teachers nodded. Some even asked how her day was going. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was more than she'd ever been given before. That Thursday, the PTA held its spring meeting in the school library. Gregory Whitmore arrived in a dark sport coat and no tie, a change that still caught people off guard. He greeted Principal Darnell with a handshake that was firm but no longer laced with silent expectations. They spoke briefly before Gregory made his way to the front row. Miss Laverne entered a few minutes later, wearing a burgundy cardigan and a smile that didn't quite stretch the whole way. She'd been invited not as staff, but as a guest of honor. When her name was mentioned in the meeting's opening remarks, a few parents clapped awkwardly, but one father stood and said, "That woman protected my kid when he split his head on the monkey bars 2 years ago. She wrapped him up before the nurse even showed up." "Well," another added, "she's the only reason half the school didn't freeze last winter. The heating went out, and she brought space heaters from her own place." By the end of the meeting, a motion had been introduced, then passed unanimously to create a new annual school recognition, the Laverne Johnson Honor Award, given to any staff member who went above and beyond in service and compassion. Laverne looked stunned when her name was announced. She glanced at Gregory, who gave her a nod. Then at Principal Darnell, who gave her a full smile this time. She rose slowly to accept a small plaque, her eyes blinking fast as she tried to find words. "I didn't expect this," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to hush the crowd. "All I ever wanted was to make this place feel safe for the little ones, because I know what it's like to not feel safe growing up, and I know what it's like to not be seen." A long pause followed. "But sometimes," she continued, "someone sees you, and that changes everything." The room erupted into applause, not polite or performative, but warm, grounded, real. Caleb, who had come with his father, watched from the back of